Hi everyone, and welcome to another installment of Terrifying Trios. This month, we're returning to a theme that you can really sink your teeth into. We're once again talking about Dracula. Over 125 years after its publication, Bram Stoker's creation is still considered a masterful epistolary novel, and hardly a year goes by when we don't see another film about Count Dracula. But who is this character, really? The way that different creators tackle the immortal vampire's mythos is fascinating, and different adaptations say a lot about the time in which they were created and the world in which we live. Content warning. The following movies and books contain graphic depictions of violence, including, you guessed it, blood, the eating of small animals and/or bugs, death, as well as stakes being stabbed through hearts. Viewer and reader discretion is advised, and as usual, spoilers will be discussed from this point forward. Our first film this month is the silent movie classic Nosferatu. Released in 1922, according to Screen Rant, which ranks this as the #1 Dracula movie ever made, the lack of sound mixed with ancient black and white camera work makes it feel like a nightmare come to life. Many argue that this is one of the most important horror films ever created, and with good reason. Almost a decade before Universal Studios began to release the series of horror films that are still celebrated today, starting in 1931 with, of course, Dracula. This German expressionist film terrified audiences, and is still a chilling tale today. The story is this. We first meet Thomas Hutter, at home with his wife, Ellen. His employer, Knock, who is delighted upon the receipt of a letter full of occult symbols, tells him he'll make good money, selling the house across from Thomas's own, to a wealthy count, who lives far away in the Carpathian Mountains. Thomas looks upon the whole affair as a great adventure, but his wife Ellen is distraught at his departure. After traveling to Transylvania, he's convinced to stay at an inn overnight, with the explanation that there's a werewolf outside. Werewolf, here meaning a skittish-looking hyena. In his room, Thomas finds a small book. It concerns vampires, spirits, bewitchment, and the 7 deadly sins. Like all inns that serve as plot points, we can assume that this one has a sizable lending library of books dealing with local legends. At daybreak, Thomas laughs and throws this book on the ground, but later it finds its way into his bag somehow, and he's able to read it at Orlok's castle, which is difficult to reach, since the locals are too frightened to venture beyond a bridge near a mountain pass. Soon, though, a disguised Orlok appears driving a coach with hooded horses. Are the horses also vampires? Anyway, they reach the castle in what appears to be daylight, but Orlok informs Hutter that it's almost midnight, and the servants have gone to bed. Almost immediately, Thomas notices some strange things about his host and the castle. First, when he cuts himself at dinner, Orlok tries to consume the blood from the wound. Waking up the next day, Thomas finds 2 small holes in his neck, but assumes that he was bitten by some kind of insect in the night. To be fair, people in vampire movies don't know that they're in vampire movies for most of the story, so I can understand that thinking that I was bitten by the world's largest mosquitoes, as opposed to assuming the owner of the castle in which I'm staying drank some of my blood while I slept. Then again, he includes this detail in a letter to Ellen, and having written a lot of letters, I can confidently say that I've never given a mosquito bite update. Later, when Orlok sees a small portrait of Thomas's wife Ellen, the Count remarks upon her, quote, lovely neck. That second night in the castle, after a happy day in the sunshine, Thomas starts to suspect Orlok isn't just a strange man. Is he a man at all? And with no way to lock the door of the room in which he's sleeping, Thomas can only watch in horror as, after the clock has struck midnight, his door swings open, and the Count appears. Thomas can't escape, but before passing out, he tries to conceal himself under a blanket. Meanwhile, his wife Ellen, back at home, is sleepwalking, and when she is discovered, standing on a balcony, she shouts, Hutter! And has a vision of Count Orlok menacing her husband. The attending physician blames Ellen's delirious condition on, quote, harmless congestion of the blood. On his final day in the castle, Thomas explores, going downstairs only to discover Count Orlok sleeping in a coffin in the castle crypt. Horrified, Thomas doesn't know what to do, but as night falls, Count Orlok doesn't return to his victim. Instead, he loads up a wagon full of boxes of earth and leaves. Quick shout out to the editors of this movie. Sometimes the film is sped up, so Orlok appears to move inhumanly fast. This technique does a great job of emphasizing his supernatural abilities. Thomas is later brought to a hospital by some farmers who believe him to be feverish. The fact that he starts raving about coffins as soon as he wakes up seems to confirm this opinion. Though still weak, he hurries toward home, presumably hoping to intercept the Count. But Orlok has already made it to the ship that will transport him to the house he just bought. On board, as with the doomed ship Demeter, all of the crew die, one by one, leaving only the captain and first mate. After the first mate sees Orlok and throws himself overboard in terror, the captain lashes himself to the tiller. We see the man seeing Orlok, and then the scene fades to black. Meanwhile, Nock is the sort of Renfield of this story, and is strongly affected by the Count's approach to the point of apparent madness. He is obsessed with an unseen master. Unfortunately, the asylum he's housed in seems to have a pretty good view of the port, so he sees the ship arrive. Count Orlok, having reached his destination, disembarks with a single coffin, which he takes to his new house. After Orlok's arrival, many people die. Local doctors believe that the rats from the ship must have spread some kind of plague, but it seems that really Orlok himself is the plague, though he fed on Hutter at least once, and Hutter survived. Thomas Hutter blames the book he found at the inn for frightening hallucinations. He doesn't seem to ever say the word vampire, or acknowledge what he went through after he returns home to Ellen. As more and more people die, eventually there are only 2 pallbearers per coffin, Ellen can't help but read the mysterious book, though it distresses her greatly. She learns that a pure-hearted woman can defeat Nosferatu by offering her blood freely. To stop the plague, Ellen plans to sacrifice herself, and invites Orlok, now her neighbor, into the house by opening her window one night. She can see him watching her from across the street. Quick sidebar: if you believe yourself to be wholly without sin, are you committing the sin of pride? Just curious. Orlok is distracted by her beauty, and Ellen, knowing that Thomas would try to stop her, had previously sent her husband to fetch a doctor, Bulwer, who's barely in this movie, but is a kind of Van Helsing figure. Orlok does consume Ellen's blood, but then the sun rises, and he fades to nothing but a puff of smoke. Ellen lives just long enough to say goodbye to a grieving Thomas, and the last shot of the film is Orlok's castle, now a ruin. This film is notable for a number of reasons. It's an unauthorized version of Dracula, but many of the story beats and characters are the same, though names have been changed to presumably prevent a lawsuit. Nosferatu was made between the First and Second World Wars, and it bears noting that the title character can be viewed as a caricature of Jewish people. Orlok is the other, a foreigner that is seen as bringing contagion from the East into a Western community, in this case a town in Germany, rather than the England of Bram Stoker's novel, which also contains stereotypical representations of people who aren't Christian and or British. So Nosferatu can be seen as representative of anti-Semitism in the early 20th century. However, writer Kevin Jackson notes that the director of Nosferatu, F.W. Murnau, was gay, and though German society was more accepting of the queer community before the Nazis rose to power, Murnau would have been, quote, presumably more sensitive to the persecution of a subgroup inside the larger German society, end quote. That doesn't mean that he necessarily avoided dealing in stereotypes, but rather used them to try and illustrate the difference between living, breathing people and stories about creatures from myth and legend. Nosferatu is also a story about the occult. In the mysterious book from the inn, it spells out that Nosferatu is a creature of Belial, an archdemon connected to pestilence, thus the plague of rats. Ellen's manner of stopping the vampire is also noteworthy. The idea of a blood sacrifice being the only cure for the sickness spread by an evil being connects to historical figures like the alchemist Paracelsus, who Bulwer the professor is noted to be a student of. This is a movie also deeply connected to war. The actor who plays Orlok, Max Schreck, like others involved in the film, including producer Alban Grau, served in World War I. As Lot Eisner, a dedicated occultist, wrote, quote, "Mysticism and magic, the dark forces to which Germans have always been more than willing to commit themselves, had flourished in the face of death on the battlefields. These forces were intrinsic to the shaping of cinema's first vampires." Producer Alban Grau made this connection too. Quote, "This monstrous event that is unleashed across the earth like a cosmic vampire to drink the blood of millions and millions of men." Overall, This film is a fascinating reflection of the time and place in which it was made, and a film that's still unnerving over a century after it was created. I'm interested to see what the Nosferatu film coming later this year looks like, given that the makeup on Bill Skarsgård seems to resemble that of Max Schreck. I don't know how this film won't avoid questions about anti-Semitism, or the necessity of endless remakes of already classic films. All that aside, I give the original Nosferatu 3 rats out of 4. Our next film this month is Dracula, the 1979 film starring Frank Langella as Dracula, with Laurence Olivier as Professor Van Helsing. This film does an admirable job of trying to combine characters to save time and streamline the narrative, though if you've read the novel, you might find this movie more confusing than the original story. Lucy Seward's dear friend Mina Van Helsing is visiting on the night that the ship Demeter is wrecked on the coast of Yorkshire, England. Lucy lives with her father, Dr. Seward, and helps him in the operation of his asylum for the insane. It should be noted that Dr. Seward is played here by Donald Pleasance, and if you've seen any of the first few Halloween movies, you might wonder if this is a man who should be in charge of the insane, not that his efforts to kill Michael Myers ever worked. While Lucy is helping her father with the patients agitated by the storm outside, Mina sees the shipwreck and goes out into the weather, where she finds Count Dracula in a cave. She touches his hand and later summons help. He is treated as the only survivor of the doomed ship Demeter. The next day, Lucy's fiancé Jonathan arrives in an automobile. The movie takes place in 1913, and the two lovers kiss enthusiastically while Dr. Seward wants to discuss the shipwreck. One man, Renfield, is annoyed with the wealthy young Jonathan Harker, and he expresses as much when Seward and Harker visit the Demeter, note the bodies and the cargo, which is taken to the Count's new home at Carfax Abbey. At dinner that night, the Count meets his new neighbors, and he mostly makes a good impression, dancing with Lucy when she invites him to do so, though at one point he's distracted by the butler cutting his finger, and he later hypnotizes Mina. This may seem odd, but we've already learned that Dr. Seward considers to be perpetually ill, and though he's willing to treat her with drugs, Mina instead recovers from a faint thanks to the Count's influence. Later, Jonathan and Lucy have a secret nighttime meeting. He was a bit jealous, watching her dance with Dracula, but the two patch things up while Mina is visited by the Count, who drinks her blood. The next day, Lucy wakes to find Mina struggling to breathe, and though she calls her father, they can only watch in horror as she dies before their very eyes. Lucy blames herself for being out with Jonathan the previous night, and after Mina has been buried, Dr. Seward goes to pick up her father, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, from the train station. By this time, Renfield has already fallen under the thrall of the Count, happily eating a bug after moving boxes of earth into Carfax Abbey. When Dr. Seward meets Dr. Van Helsing, obviously the latter is distressed about his daughter's sudden death. When Seward mentions the 2 small wounds on her neck, Van Helsing becomes convinced that this was no ordinary malady. They return to the seaside in Yorkshire, and soon investigate the mines beneath the place where Mina was buried. Mina is there, now ghastly white, her eyes bright red, one of the undead. She only dies for good when her father desperately stabs her through the heart. Seward, who spends much of this movie snacking, is shocked to find that all this talk of vampires is true. From here on, crosses and stakes become important, though not always perfect tools for our heroes. This is the point in the film in which social rules, depending on your point of view, either doom Lucy or allow her the freedom to express her true feelings, since she and her father were invited to Carfax Abbey by the Count. Dracula speaks with Jonathan before the dinner with Lucy, since he has business outside of Yorkshire, and so Lucy goes to the Abbey alone. It seems from a desire to honor the invitation, but also out of interest in the Count. At dinner, Lucy enjoys the Count's company. While walking by the sea, they kiss, and though we typically see Dracula forcing himself on the women he feeds from, or hypnotizing them into accepting the situation, Lucy expresses her love and attraction, and he is the one to tell her that they must be patient if they're to be together. The poster for this film does call it, quote, a love story. It should also be noted that this is one of the few Dracula films in which we get to see the Count climbing like a lizard on the outside of a building. This is how he got to Mina, and he comes to Lucy in the same way, looking more like a seductive figure than a predator. And a surreal scene ensues when the Count feeds from Lucy, and the pair seem to consummate their relationship. Again, though, whether Lucy really wants all this or has been hypnotized by Dracula is left unclear. Dracula previously praised Lucy as a strong woman, but given that he's an immortal vampire, there's definitely a power imbalance here. After this night with Dracula, the events of which affect Lucy's behavior and appearance, Seward and Van Helsing are now convinced that they know what Dracula is, and they soon realize, after Lucy escapes the asylum and heads straight for Carfax Abbey, that Dracula must be destroyed if the spell on Lucy is to be broken. The viewer is left to their own thoughts on how much Lucy is a willing participant in this relationship. While yes, she seems attracted to the Count, she is also horrified by her adverse reaction to seeing a cross. Van Helsing gives her a necklace with a cross after Mina's death, but Lucy takes it off before the night she spends with Dracula. Jonathan's automobile is almost as important a character as Jonathan himself. He wants to save his fiancée, but the usual tools of vampire killing aren't always effective here. When Jonathan points a cross at Dracula when he and Van Helsing confront him in Carfax Abbey, it bursts into flames, and Dracula escapes in bat form. Even in daylight, he's a powerful enemy as long as he stays out of the sunlight. Dracula next goes to the asylum, where he murders Renfield, frees Lucy, and sets off to return to Transylvania. But now, he's being hunted by Jonathan, Seward, and Van Helsing. The final act of this film is dominated by a chase scene. Jonathan chases a cart carrying Dracula's boxes of earth toward port to be shipped out of England, but Dracula's influence over the horses is such that the man driving the coach can't stop them. Eventually, he is thrown from the wagon, killing him, and Jonathan's car is wrecked, but the horses race on, forcing the trio of men to go to the port on foot. When the three finally arrive, they quickly determine which ship Dracula and Lucy are aboard. Jonathan and Van Helsing are able to catch up. It's not fully out to sea yet, but in trying to stake Dracula, Lucy wakes the vampire, and Van Helsing is impaled on the very stake he meant to use on the Count. While Dracula moves to attack Jonathan, a dying Van Helsing is able to throw a rope with a hook at the end that's hanging from the ship's rigging into Dracula's back. Then Jonathan pulls the other end of the rope, dragging the Count up into the sunlight, where he appears to burn up and die. Lucy seems to become her old self again, but she smiles oddly when she sees the Count's cape caught in the wind, sailing into some clouds. This is certainly a visually compelling and lively adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. While Dracula has, in many iterations, been treated as a seductive figure, it's especially emphasized here that women may want to cast aside the promise of conventional marriage and instead live forever with the handsome Count. While many critics praised the film, especially Langella's performance, others were not so kind. It bears noting, this movie was released in the same year as Werner Herzog's remake of Nosferatu, as well as the film Love at First Bite, which was a horror comedy retelling of Dracula, so it was a busy year for vampire cinema. Hilariously, Leonard Maltin gave this film 1.5 stars. If, like me, you're a fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000, you know that he also gave such gems as the film Laser Blast 2.5 stars. Personally, I like seeing how frightening Mina was as a vampire, and overall, this was a fun, atmospheric take on the classic tale. I give it 3 stakes out of 5. Our book this month is Universal Monsters, Dracula. Published by Skybound, an imprint of Image Comics, this graphic novel was nominated for an Eisner Award in 2024, and it's truly one of the most beautiful, haunting graphic novels that I've read this year. It's also the first in a series of comics starring different Universal monsters. The second series, starring the creature from the Black Lagoon, arrived just in time to celebrate the original film's 70th anniversary, and a miniseries starring Frankenstein is up next. While James Tynion IV does a great job of centering Dracula's victims in this story, namely Lucy, Mina, and Renfield, I would argue that the most haunting part of this graphic novel are the illustrations by Martin Simmons. Gorgeous paintings that seem to bleed off the page really highlight the way that Dracula's arrival in England spreads outward to infect all he touches. Renfield is the victim we get to know best. He acknowledges that he is a small man, and he wanted to travel to Transylvania, so he could come home with stories, to show those who laughed at him that he could really do things. Instead, he came back with a hunger for blood. Only little lives, like those of bugs and spiders. Not big ones. Not human lives, like those the Master takes. Eventually, Dracula allows Renfield to eat rats, and while he is delighted, Renfield also has misgivings. After all, Mina Seward, daughter of Dr. Seward, was kind to him. She was the only person to ever be kind to him in his state of insanity, and he wishes Dracula would let her live in peace. It bears noting that Dr. Seward, for his part, wants to cure Renfield by giving him blood transfusions. Renfield, as you can imagine, is horrified by this idea, and with all of Dracula's victims in this story, giving them new blood doesn't help. There is no scientific answer to this supernatural threat. This book ends as the movie does. Dracula murders Renfield, who he blames for leading the trio of men who would kill him to his home, and then Dracula is staked by Van Helsing. But while Jonathan Harker and Van Helsing are working to kill the vampire and save Mina, Seward talks with Renfield as he dies. Renfield explains that Dracula cannot really die. There will always be small men like Renfield, eager to serve an evil force in hopes of becoming a bit bigger. Van Helsing too acknowledges that victory against such a threat is only ever temporary. But Mina is freed, and before he dies, Seward forgives Renfield, and he feels that he will die as a man, not as something else. The story of Dracula persists for many reasons, and one of these, ironically, is that the tale of the Count is a bit like a mirror. What you see in this story reflects not just the outside world in which you live, but the interior life of the mind. For over a century, the story of a vampire has thrilled, repulsed, and forced readers and viewers to confront questions of faith, loyalty, and how far you would go to save a loved one. The vampire is a metaphor for disease, xenophobia, lust, and also a creature that stands in for all we don't yet know about the world. It also illustrates the appeal of horror fiction. You may be repelled by what's happening, but you also can't wait to see what happens next. And though the vampire is usually defeated at the conclusion of the story, Renfield is right. Dracula will never truly die. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another terrifying trio.